Korea, 1950. MacArthur is surrounded by Chinese forces. His army is in retreat. Thousands of American soldiers are dying, and he sends a message requesting permission to use atomic weapons to stop the Chinese advance. President Truman and his advisors are horrified. But there's another voice in these discussions that history often overlooks. Dwight Eisenhower, who understands both nuclear weapons and the reality of fighting in Asia. What Eisenhower says about MacArthur's nuclear request reveals the moment when America decides what kind of superpower it will be. This isn't just about one general wanting to use extreme force. It's about whether nuclear weapons are tools of war, or weapons so terrible they can never be used except as a last resort. The answer Eisenhower gives will define American nuclear policy for the next 70 years. November 1950. MacArthur's forces are in crisis. Chinese troops have crossed the Yalu River in massive numbers. American units are surrounded, fighting for survival in freezing Korean mountains. The confident advance that nearly unified Korea under democratic rule has turned into a desperate retreat. MacArthur, who promised victory, now faces potential catastrophe. His response is to request authorization to use atomic weapons against Chinese forces and supply lines in Manchuria. The request shocks Washington. America has only used nuclear weapons twice, both times to end World War II against Japan. The idea of using them again, just 5 years later, in a limited war in Asia, seems almost incomprehensible. But MacArthur's logic is straightforward. He argues that conventional forces cannot stop the massive Chinese intervention. He claims that using atomic weapons on Chinese staging areas in Manchuria would eliminate their ability to supply troops in Korea. He frames this as a military necessity, not as escalation, but as the only realistic response to Chinese aggression. President Truman immediately rejects the idea, but the request triggers intense debate in Washington. Military planners are asked to assess the feasibility. Intelligence agencies evaluate what Soviet response might be. And Eisenhower, who at this point is serving as president of Columbia University but remains deeply connected to military planning, is consulted about his views. His opinion carries enormous weight because he commanded Allied forces in Europe, understands strategic planning at the highest level, and has no political agenda that might color his judgment. Eisenhower's initial response to MacArthur's request is more nuanced than Truman's outright rejection. He understands the military desperation that drives MacArthur's thinking. He knows that Chinese intervention has created a genuine crisis that conventional weapons might not solve. But he also sees something that MacArthur either doesn't see or refuses to acknowledge. Using nuclear weapons in Korea would change the fundamental nature of warfare and America's position in the world. His analysis goes beyond the immediate military situation to consider long-term strategic consequences. What troubles Eisenhower most is MacArthur's apparent belief that nuclear weapons are simply bigger conventional weapons. MacArthur's request treats atomic bombs as artillery that happens to be more powerful. He's proposing to use them for tactical battlefield purposes, destroying enemy concentrations and supply lines. Eisenhower understands that nuclear weapons are categorically different. They're not just more powerful bombs, they're weapons that create moral, political, and strategic consequences far beyond their immediate military effects. This fundamental disagreement about what nuclear weapons are will shape the entire debate. Eisenhower's analysis of MacArthur's nuclear request demonstrates why he will later become such an effective president. He approaches the question from multiple angles: military effectiveness, political consequences, moral implications, and long-term strategic positioning. His conclusion is that using nuclear weapons in Korea would be a catastrophic mistake, but his reasoning is sophisticated and goes far beyond simple moral objections. From a purely military standpoint, Eisenhower questions whether nuclear weapons would actually solve MacArthur's problem. Chinese forces are not massed in large concentrations where atomic bombs would be most effective. They're dispersed across difficult terrain, often mixed with civilian populations. Using nuclear weapons against such targets would kill enormous numbers of civilians, while potentially missing many military targets. The military benefit would be limited and uncertain, while the costs would be immediate and enormous. The political consequences worry Eisenhower even more. Using nuclear weapons in Korea would terrify America's allies, many of whom are still recovering from World War II and desperately hoping that nuclear weapons will never be used again. It would give the Soviet Union a propaganda victory, allowing them to portray America as a reckless aggressor willing to use the most terrible weapons in human history for limited military objectives. It would potentially drive neutral nations toward the Soviet camp and fracture the Western alliance that Eisenhower helped build. But the deepest level of Eisenhower's analysis concerns what using nuclear weapons in Korea would mean for the future. If America uses atomic bombs in a limited war to solve a temporary military problem, it establishes a precedent that these weapons are acceptable tools of warfare. It lowers the threshold for nuclear use and makes it more likely that they'll be used again in future conflicts. It risks triggering an arms race where nuclear weapons become normalized as battlefield weapons rather than remaining deterrents that are never actually employed. Eisenhower also worries about Soviet response. He knows that Stalin has nuclear weapons, though fewer and less advanced than America's arsenal. If America uses nuclear weapons in Korea, what stops the Soviet Union from using them in the next crisis? What stops the next war from becoming a nuclear exchange that destroys civilization? MacArthur is thinking tactically about solving an immediate problem. Eisenhower is thinking strategically about maintaining global stability and preventing World War III. His perspective encompasses consequences that MacArthur either ignores or considers less important than winning in Korea. The disagreement between MacArthur and Eisenhower represents a fundamental clash of military philosophies. MacArthur believes in total commitment and total victory. If America is going to fight a war, it should use every available weapon to win decisively. Holding back nuclear weapons while soldiers are dying seems to him like fighting with one hand tied behind your back. It's sacrificing American lives for political considerations that he views as secondary to military victory. Eisenhower's philosophy is different. He believes that war is an extension of policy, and that military actions must serve broader strategic objectives. Using nuclear weapons might help win in Korea, but it could lose the larger Cold War by alienating allies, emboldening enemies, and normalizing nuclear warfare. In Eisenhower's view, sometimes restraint in war serves victory better than unleashing maximum force. This is a mature understanding that comes from years of coalition warfare and strategic planning at the highest levels. The personal dynamics matter too. MacArthur, older and more experienced in combat, sees Eisenhower as essentially a staff officer who rose through political skill rather than battlefield command. MacArthur led troops in combat in World War I and commanded forces in the Pacific. Eisenhower commanded the European theater but was primarily a coordinator and strategist. MacArthur doesn't explicitly say it, but his attitude suggests he thinks Eisenhower doesn't understand the brutal realities of combat that make nuclear weapons necessary. Eisenhower respects MacArthur's combat record, but questions his judgment on strategic matters. He sees MacArthur as brilliant tactically, but sometimes blind to political realities. Eisenhower's experience coordinating allies, managing competing national interests, and thinking about global strategy gives him perspective that MacArthur lacks. He understands that winning battles while losing the broader political struggle is ultimately defeat, and that's exactly what using nuclear weapons in Korea would accomplish. When Eisenhower communicates his views to the Truman administration, he frames his opposition to MacArthur's request carefully. He doesn't question MacArthur's patriotism or courage. He acknowledges the desperate military situation, but he argues that using nuclear weapons would be strategically counterproductive regardless of any temporary tactical advantage. His analysis helps crystallize opposition to MacArthur's plan and reinforces Truman's instinct that using nuclear weapons in Korea crosses a line that should not be crossed. President Truman, influenced by Eisenhower's analysis and his own instincts, definitively rejects MacArthur's request to use nuclear weapons. But the disagreement over nuclear policy contributes to the growing rift between MacArthur and civilian leadership. MacArthur believes he's being prevented from winning a war that America is committed to fighting. He thinks political considerations are sacrificing American lives. This frustration eventually leads to his public statements criticizing administration policy, which in turn leads to his dismissal in April 1951. The decision not to use nuclear weapons in Korea establishes a precedent that shapes American military policy for decades. It creates the principle that nuclear weapons are not simply more powerful conventional weapons to be used whenever militarily convenient. They become a special category of weapon held in reserve as deterrents, to be used only in the most extreme circumstances. This principle, largely shaped by Eisenhower's analysis, becomes fundamental to Cold War strategy. When Eisenhower becomes president in 1953, one of his first priorities is ending the Korean War. Interestingly, he uses the threat of nuclear weapons as a diplomatic tool without actually planning to use them. He lets it be known through diplomatic channels that if negotiations fail, America might consider nuclear options. This threat, which Eisenhower has no intention of carrying out, helps motivate communist negotiators to reach an armistice. It's a sophisticated use of nuclear weapons as political tools rather than battlefield weapons. Exactly the kind of strategic thinking that MacArthur's approach would have made impossible. The Korean War ends in stalemate, which many see as vindicating MacArthur's criticism that America wasn't committed to victory. But from Eisenhower's perspective, the stalemate is acceptable because it achieves the core objective, preventing communist expansion while avoiding World War III. South Korea remains free, America's alliances are intact, and nuclear weapons remain unused. These outcomes serve American interests better than winning in Korea through nuclear weapons would have, even though the victory is less satisfying emotionally. The long-term consequences of rejecting MacArthur's nuclear request are profound. The precedent that nuclear weapons should not be used in limited wars becomes deeply embedded in American military culture. Even when later presidents face similar pressures in Vietnam and other conflicts, the threshold for nuclear use remains extremely high. The decision in Korea helps establish the nuclear taboo that keeps these weapons from being used for over 70 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What Eisenhower said about MacArthur's request to use nuclear weapons in Korea was more than just opposition to one general's plan. It was a comprehensive argument for why nuclear weapons must be treated differently than conventional weapons, even when military logic might suggest using them. His reasoning established principles that remain relevant today as more nations acquire nuclear weapons and the risks of nuclear conflict persist. The fundamental insight Eisenhower provided was that in the nuclear age, winning every battle can mean losing the war. Using nuclear weapons in Korea might have helped American forces in the short term, but it would have created strategic disasters that far outweighed any tactical advantage. This understanding, that restraint sometimes serves victory better than maximum force, runs counter to MacArthur's total war philosophy but proves more effective in managing superpower competition. The personal dimension of this story remains instructive. MacArthur was not a reckless warmonger. He was a brilliant commander, trying to save his troops using every available tool. But his focus on immediate military problems blinded him to broader strategic consequences. Eisenhower, with his coalition warfare experience and strategic perspective, saw what MacArthur missed. Sometimes the most dangerous military leaders are not those who want to lose, but those who want to win so badly, they're willing to risk everything else. The precedent established in Korea faces new challenges today. As nuclear weapons spread to more nations, as regional conflicts create pressures to consider nuclear options, the question of when and whether to use these weapons remains urgent. MacArthur's argument that nuclear weapons are necessary to win wars hasn't disappeared. But Eisenhower's counter-argument that using nuclear weapons creates worse problems than it solves has proven its wisdom across 70 years of managing nuclear arsenals without using them. The ultimate legacy is that America chose Eisenhower's vision over MacArthur's. Nuclear weapons became political tools and strategic deterrents rather than battlefield weapons. This choice shaped the Cold War, prevented nuclear exchanges during multiple crises, and created a norm against nuclear use that remains powerful today. Whether this norm can survive future pressures is uncertain, but the wisdom Eisenhower demonstrated in opposing MacArthur's request provides guidance for leaders facing similar choices in different circumstances. What Eisenhower said when MacArthur asked for permission to use nuclear weapons in Korea was essentially this: winning in Korea is important, but not more important than maintaining the principle that nuclear weapons should not be used in limited wars. His analysis prevented what could have been a catastrophic decision and established norms that shaped American nuclear policy for generations. MacArthur wanted to win the immediate battle using every available weapon. Eisenhower understood that some victories come at prices too high to pay, and that restraint in the face of temporary defeat can serve long-term interests better than immediate military success. The decision made in Korea reverberated through decades of nuclear standoffs, helping to keep these terrible weapons from being used again. In choosing Eisenhower's strategic wisdom over MacArthur's tactical demands, America defined what kind of nuclear power it would be. If you found this exploration of nuclear strategy, military restraint, and the choice between winning battles and winning wars valuable, consider subscribing for more stories about the decisions that shaped our world.